And when we do that as well, it makes the relationship healthy, which
Oh,
makes us
yeah.
happy. It's,
Absolutely. It becomes a
yes,
pleasure. It's a joy.
yes,
You know,
yes,
we all know if you're a bit on edge with somebody,
yes,
takes the shine off it. If you've worked through something, there's just a joy and a depth, and
absolutely.
and that's why I say conflict isn't actually the problem. It's what we do with it when attitudes are exposed. Are we willing to work through those attitudes so that we're unpacking our oneness?
Welcome back to Grow Your Dreams podcast. I'm very excited to present this episode to you with John Sparks. He is an author, counselor, and pastor, and he has been so for the past coming up to 50 years, which means he has a wealth of knowledge and experience and insight into handling people's conflicts, helping marriages, helping people with work conflicts, helping parent-child conflicts. And this is just the most beautiful episode, so enjoy it. Just a little side note is that John mentions temperaments. So temperaments is a big thing in understanding the person in front of you, knowing what their temperament is and how they perceive situations and how they react to certain situations, and also the qualities that lie within that person. If you do not know what your temperament is, or you have no idea what temperaments are, please listen back to the episodes with John Sparks called either Understanding Yourself, or you will see, if you read back through the different episodes from the first season, you'll find a wealth of temperament content there. So enjoy that, enjoy this episode, and be blessed. No, that's good. You look very intelligent with all your books behind you, so people will know
Yeah,
you're well read.
hopefully. Yes.
John, thank you so much for joining me again today.
Lovely to be back with you again and looking forward to this podcast.
Yes, I always love having chats with you and getting all sorts of insights about how to live life.
Yes.
And today we want to talk about relationships and conflict in relationships. And I know you and I have had many personal conversations about my own relationship conflicts, and I've always found them very helpful. So it would just be great to, for you to share your heart and your thoughts and your understanding on how to deal with relationship conflict. So I'm just going to hand the mic over to you, so to speak, and kind of let you just go into it. How do we
Yeah.
handle relationship conflict? Where do we begin?
Right. Well, the first thing I think to understand is, sadly, it is going to happen. And it doesn't mean when it does happen that you're necessarily doing something wrong. You might be, and that is obviously worth looking at. But let's start from the point that because there's good and evil in this world, because there are good attitudes and not so good attitudes, there's going to be a clash. And that clash creates conflict. Jesus made it very clear to his disciples that they were in this world, but not of the world, and that they would have conflict, and that in fact people would hate them. And he said that just as they hated him without a cause, because the servant isn't greater than his master, they would do the same to them. And in another context, he said, "Don't think that I've come to bring peace, but I've come to bring division." Now, if you take that out of context, obviously that can be misapplied and misunderstood, because the whole message of salvation is of God's peace. But there has to be a point of division between that which is good, that which is of God, and that which is against the good. So don't assume if you run into conflict that you're doing something wrong. It's very important to think very clearly when conflict arises.
And how does conflict arise in relationships? Where does it start?
There's a number of reasons for that, and I'm thinking of conflict on a fairly broad basis. So it could well be conflict between a parent with a child. Could be as simple as a child being told to do something they don't want to do, making a fuss and everything else, that all the fallout from that. It could be friend with friend. It could be within a church setting, a work setting, even a leisure setting, setting down at the local gym. You can end up falling out with people.
And work is a big one, having
Work
conflict
is
in
a
work
very big
relationships.
one.
Yeah.
That's one that comes up again and again. And
Yes.
sometimes people move to try and get away from conflict in the office or whatever. And then there is another character in wherever they move to that is possibly even worse. So it's part of life. It's all around us. So that's why a good understanding of it, I think, can be very helpful. Your question of how does it arise, I think that's a really key thing to understand. So the first thing we've said is that there will be conflict because there'll be a clash between right and wrong. But often the root of conflict lies in a different perspective. Same situation, different perspective. And the perspective produces attitudes, and attitudes express themselves sometimes in dogmatic or unhelpful ways. So, what we could say is there's a kind of way of looking at things. So, let's go to a practical relationship situation. Let's say it's between husband and wife, or could be boyfriend, girlfriend, could actually be two friends, but it's sometimes easier to make it clear in a marriage situation. So the wife is trying, and it's often this way around, not exclusively so, obviously, but is trying to say something to her husband. Now he will have a certain perspective on his wife and on what she's saying. So, for example, she might be trying to say, "Look, that that job really needs doing. You know, I asked you to fix that tap 5 years ago, and it's still dripping, and it's really getting to me. And we've got guests coming next weekend. Please, could you kindly do this tiny job of fixing the tap and putting a new washer on?" Now, if according to his sort of attitude to his wife, he'll either see her as just a nag bag who is always finding something that he needs to be doing. Doesn't she understand that he's busy and he hasn't time to fiddle about with silly little things like that? Or he will have a perspective that says, this really matters to my wife and I really care about her. And yes, if I think about it, it was 5 years ago she asked me to do it. And yes, we have got visitors. So, okay, that's now moved to the top of my list of priorities for jobs to be done. It's down to perspective, as how you see the person. In a way, it's, I suppose, illustrating the very simple point that the ultimate resolution of conflict is love, for those who will live in love. There's a lovely verse Paul writes, and he says, as far as it lies within you, live at peace with all. He says with all men, but it's obviously men and women. So there's an acknowledgement that sometimes we can't control the situation, but as far as it's down to us, let's resolve conflict. Let's sort it out. Let's understand. Let's make sure that we've got a good perspective and a good attitude, so that we can talk this thing through and come to a place of understanding and resolution.
Do you think that attitude trumps like past wounds, I would say, because I'm just thinking of a particular friend, and also from my own experience, maybe sometimes you can have conflict come up in relationship because of previous trauma or situations that you've experienced that make you overreact, or I'm thinking of a romantic relationship when maybe you're insecure. Maybe a
Yeah.
very, very insecure person gets into a relationship with someone, and then there's always conflict because I guess conflict just always arises from an insecure person.
Yes.
So, how does that, what do you do in those situations when
Yeah.
it's not so much about attitude, it's more about like a deep seated issue you have in yourself that's not going to be resolved
Yes.
overnight?
Well, you're making a very important point here. I have a little kind of saying that goes something like this: we all got damaged to a greater or lesser extent through relationships that weren't what they should be. We can all be healed through relationships that are what they should be. And that's why I believe so strongly in church and it being the family of God with Jesus as the head of that family. And when we submit to his attitudes, then we can build relationships together that actually bring healing into exactly
Mm,
those kind of areas. Now, that requires patience, it requires conversations, it requires people not just reacting to what is presented. As you rightly say, there'll often be a history and a person will behave in perhaps a completely inappropriate way, and we can react negatively towards that, or we can actually be committed to that person, ask if they're willing to have that kind of conversation in which you're looking at underlying issues, and that's where the healing can flow in.
mm,
So again, another little kind of saying of mine, you develop these simple principles over the years. Within the church, we don't have a problem with problems. There are always opportunities to grow, and that could
mm.
sound quite trite, but that really is true. If there's a fallout here or difficulty there, okay, that's a lovely opportunity to talk about underlying perspectives that enable us to bring in a, a truly biblical perspective and ultimately the love of God into that
Yes.
relationship. And that's healing.
Yes. And then what happens when one of the parties, their perspective doesn't change? It's
Yes,
just ingrained. And, because I think there's a lot of people that could, there's this Christian concept of being committed and loving, and not
yes,
giving up. But, there must come a point where you're just hitting a brick wall and the conflict can't be resolved
yes,
because perspectives aren't changing for whatever
yes,
reason.
yes, yes. A very important question. Um, Let me just say something before I directly answer
Yeah.
that. Many years ago, we set out to um, establish a biblical church. I mean, I know that's each Christian's desire, so I understand that. But what we did was call people to relationship. So we have a very simple commitment to uphold one another in love. So, in other words, our currency is relationship. So, in response to Jesus' prayer, John 17, his prayer that we would be one. And by this shall all men know that you're my disciples, because you have love one for another, and so on. That's also in John's Gospel. So if we've set ourselves to that, then when somebody comes along to the church and then asks if they can join the church, that is spelt out, that we're actually committing ourselves to the relationship. So hopefully that opens the door to have the kind of conversation that that you're referring to, where there's perhaps initially a kind of resistance, and so then you bring patience and love and persistence to bear. And then to your question, well, what happens if even after all of that? The truth is you have to let them go. You can't control, you can't apply any wrong kind of pressure. It has to be the path of love. And if you can part company amiably, that's better. But yes, at least the person needs to know that they're loved, and that you persisted and were consistent. Now, I know what I've just described sounds very ideal, and sadly, there are conflicts and all sorts of misunderstandings flying about and all the rest. But that's why it's important for leadership in a church to have the ability to identify the underlying issues and to offer the help at that level of the underlying issue. So in one way, it's the you don't want the person to leave the church because they did this and they did that and they got thrown out. And I've been in situations where somebody clearly has an issue. I'm thinking of somebody who had the capacity to even be a danger within the church. And I did say, you're very welcome, but we need to have conversations so that you can begin to overcome some of these tendencies. And he did respond, and then he pulled the plug on it, which just left no choice. So I would always go for the underlying issues. I'd always be trying to help the whole person, always be trying to bring that healing. If they misinterpret that, or if they're so set in their ways that, and so dogmatic, I can't do anything about that. And you have to let them go. And
that's disappointing, isn't it, though?
Oh, it's awful.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a biblical sort of structure for that in Matthew 18, and Jesus says, if your brother has sinned against you, go, and it's very sensible. Obviously, it would be because Jesus said it, but it's very practical. Go and have a chat with your brother, try and sort this thing out. But then if he won't listen, widen it a bit, and that's where I think the leadership can get involved, and it can be an opportunity for healing. But if you won't listen, and it's obviously a serious issue that's being referred to there, then sadly it has to go to the whole church. And so the person really has, in effect, excluded themselves. So that does happen. And we have to acknowledge that, a person's heart has to be open and willing to receive help and healing.
Shall we bring it down to, kind of take it outside of the church? What if it's, I guess there's so many different reasons for conflict, but if it's, say, a situation at work where you've got conflict with someone, they're not a believer, they haven't got the same, values or goals for relationship, what advice would you give to someone who's in a hard relationship with someone at work and they just, it's making them anxious, it makes them a bit fearful, it's making them maybe want to leave the job, because of the conflict, and it's uncomfortable? How do you deal with that situation if the other person, is coming from a completely different point of view?
Yes. Okay. The first thing is it will test how secure you are.
Yes.
Because if you've got a person who is being unreasonable, it may well tap into scenarios in your upbringing or even in former situations that you've been in. And if you weren't able to work through some of those things, in other words, if you blamed yourself for stuff that was not your issue, but perhaps either was a parent or even a sibling or somebody else in a former place of employment. If those issues are not resolved, then you will just connect it all up with your current situation. And that really becomes, that can make it feel unbearable. So the first thing is to ask yourself the question, how secure am I in this? So let's say somebody is saying stuff about you completely unreasonably. It's very important to be able to look objectively at that and to be able to say sometimes if she's got a point or he's got a point, okay, maybe I can do that a bit better. But probably 9 times out of 10, it will be a case of the person being quite unreasonable if they've got their issues. And in that moment of time, you have to keep your head straight. You have to keep your thinking straight. And you have to settle it that although it was horrible what they've just said to you, it's actually not true. And that I know that's easier said than done, especially if somebody's had a background of not being affirmed and made to feel valued and so on. But if you can begin to see the wood from the trees and recognize this is somebody else's issues spilling out onto you, then you can begin to think, no, that what that person said is not going to define my thinking about myself.
Yes.
I know who I am. I'm settled
Yes.
in what I know. I'm good at my job. So that's another important part of this. I do think if you put those provisos in place, I do think it can reach a point where a person can have crossed a certain line and can have become so unreasonable that you can't just ignore it. You can't just absorb that stuff. And then you're into possibly addressing them and standing up for yourself, which is an important part of this. And, if a bully will find the point of weakness. So if they know that by saying certain things, they're going to make you angry or send you off in tears or whatever, they'll exploit that. So learn to stand up for yourself. So speak to them. Say, I'm sorry. I just refuse to be spoken to like that. You need to understand what effect what you've just said has on somebody, but not from a place of weakness. But I'm sorry, you don't speak to me like that. I know it's difficult if they're senior to you in an organization. If they persist in that behavior, then you go above them. And you mustn't be afraid to do that. You go above them and you speak to somebody about what's going on.
Yes.
If in a way, that's the equivalent of what we were saying there about a church situation where it ends up with the leadership. If the boss, the big boss, doesn't deal with it and you're being subject to this and it's not, it's getting to you, however secure you are, it's just sheer unpleasantness day after day, then as a very last resort, it may well be worth considering leaving. But I would take all those steps beforehand, because you shouldn't have to lose a job because of somebody else's bullying.
And I'd also say, as having dealt with my own insecurities and situations at work, I found that I doubted myself in terms of if I should stand up for myself. And, I guess because that insecurity makes you feel maybe
Yes.
not strong enough to stand up for yourself. So
Yes.
it is about really developing that muscle. And I have been in a situation where I learned to stand up for myself, even though I was very, very nervous to do so. But it's actually built a greater strength in me. So now I
Yes.
know I can stand up for myself.
Yes.
And it actually did resolve the situation.
Yes. No, that's
Yes.
good, and that's excellent, and brings encouragement to others to stand up for themselves.
Yes.
Again, just worth putting this in that I see church as like the family of God. And just as you send your children out into the big wide world, into different situations, different jobs and everything, so the different members of the church go out into different places of employment. So there should be somebody, hopefully within the leadership, where if you're having those kind of struggles at work and you're part of a good church, then it's right to ask to be able to talk these things through and to get encouragement and strength for that, so you're ready for when you go back into the difficult situation.
Yes. So you've been counseling people for about 40 years now, I think
Yes,
you
at
told me
least.
once.
Yes.
Yes.
Going
What
up
what
towards 50 now, I think.
Wow.
Yes.
That's just fantastic, John. So I guess you've got lots of experience of helping people handle conflicts. That's why
Yes.
this topic is so important. Is there a specific area of conflict that comes up more so than others? So whether it is people in work or marriages, or what would you say is the most common conflict relationship that you deal with?
It would be marriage, and because that's where I kind of get called into.
Assist,
I've
yes.
got a very good practical example of this, and I'll speak carefully because I wouldn't want anybody to
Yes.
feel I was speaking out of turn here. But basically, a man whose marriage was in danger of falling to pieces. He did come and see me, and then he and his wife came and saw me, and I was able to describe to him who his wife was, and he had no idea who she was and of her amazing qualities.
Sorry, John, before you go on, just because someone might be listening and thinking, how does this man know his wife more than the husband? What do you mean about you kind of explained to the husband who the wife was?
Because I knew what her temperaments were. She was a double
Temperament.
introvert,
Okay.
and he
And you knew
was,
all the qualities within the
yes,
temperament. Yes.
and he was a good outgoing choleric.
Okay.
And so they both came over. And then I heard very little. I just assumed the marriage had fallen to pieces and hadn't gone anywhere. But I got an email just a few days ago to say that they were back together and had been for some years. They were more in love than ever before.
Wonderful.
And it was largely due to understanding the difference between the two of them. And they were serving the Lord together, and they were able to help other couples who were struggling on their journey.
Wonderful.
And I think that's the key to being able to say, look, and it's often this way around, you're saying, look, your wife's not crazy. She's not some neurotic woman who's just got a thing about this, that, or the other. You know, this actually matters. This is the stuff of life. So it covers couples who are married. It covers people preparing for marriage. Quite often, another big, probably the second area, would be parent-child. And when I say a child, it doesn't have to be a young child. It can be. And you're helping the parent to try and get into the shoes of what that child would feel in a given situation. And good parents will work at that and give the child security. But parents that are emotionally lazy will just assume that their offspring are kind of some slightly different version of who they are. So they will expect them to react to issues in the same way that they do. Whereas, countless occasions I've sat and said, look, this is what you just said there that the child will hear. I was asked to help, again, I have to speak carefully here. I was asked to help a family in a large town, many, many miles away from Suffolk. And the young lady, 18-year-old, was in very serious emotional difficulty, a complete breakdown. And then the family were very good to us, invited my wife and I up for a meal. They paid for us to stay in the area for a couple of nights so that we could have 2 or 3 days counselling within this family. And we sat down at the meal table the very first evening, and you could feel the dynamics. You could feel where each of the people were. And I almost didn't need anything else. I knew why that child was in a mess. She was, parents loved her to bits, very kind, but I hadn't a clue who she was or how to connect with her. And just brought about this awful breakdown, really. So there was a conflict, and there was an ongoing conflict, and we sat and said to especially the mum, look, this is what your daughter was feeling in that situation. So that's the key thing, whether it's a husband, and sometimes it's the other way around, the wife, whether it's friend to friend, whether it's parent with child. We need to hear what is actually being conveyed. And often I've had to virtually interpret or translate, look, this is what this person will hear, because that's what you're actually saying. You don't realize you're saying that, but that's what you're saying. I don't know if this is helpful. I remember saying to a married couple, I said to the husband, don't just think that your wife is like another version of you. So you're trying to empathize, and the husband was very good and was really trying to understand. Don't take who you are and put yourself into your wife's shoes. Sort of wipe the slate clean and say, right, this is my wife. She is a completely different creature to who I am. She has a different set of feelings. She's a woman anyway, so that kind of makes a difference. She's different temperament. And so I need to let her be my starting point rather than imposing onto her how I would feel or respond in that situation. And that's an absolute key in resolving conflict. What you want is the other person to turn around and say, you really get it, don't you? You get who I am. That's what we need. That's the context in which conflict is resolved. And because what you can do is you can end up just firefighting. Let's say the dripping tap, to go back to the earlier illustration, there might be 20 other jobs that need doing in the house. And the guy might think, oh, I really must try and get all these jobs done. But if he hasn't taken the opportunity to get into his wife's shoes, to feel what it feels like to be helpless, because she can't phone the plumber because he'll get cross because it's his job to do, and she's trapped. And if it means waiting 5 years, she's had to wait 5 years. And for him to see that it would show such love to just say, look, I'm really sorry. I've just not been fair to you. It must be awful to be in that situation where you have to wait for somebody else. Then the wife will know, okay, this is being resolved. Much more than just the fact he shot off in a bad mood upstairs and fixed the tap. He's understood what his wife feels and has felt all these years, and has probably handled herself very well. And that's how stuff gets resolved. And that's how the two become one. And that should operate in the church as well. Jesus prayed that we would be one. Paul writes and says, maintain the unity of the Spirit. God says in marriage, the two become one. So that's a gift. It's the gift of oneness. But we spend the rest of our lives unpacking the gift. We don't have to create the oneness. It's there already. But it requires me and each of us to slow down, to hear the other person, to be open, to have humility, to be honest, and to genuinely love by putting the other person first. And that's how we grow, and that's how we live in the oneness that God has already given us.
And when we do that as well, it makes the relationship healthy, which makes us happy.
Absolutely. It becomes a pleasure. It's a joy.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
we all know if you're a bit on edge with somebody,
Yes.
takes the shine off it. If you've worked through something, there's just a joy and a depth, and
absolutely,
you know, and that's why I say conflict isn't actually the problem. It's what we do with it when attitudes are exposed. Are we willing to work through those attitudes so that we're unpacking our oneness?
These concepts are so simple, but I do feel like a lot of people, including myself, can just miss it.
Yes.
Because, and I think it's probably because we haven't been taught, or it hasn't been clarified in this simple way, or we don't keep it as a goal. We get caught up in the busyness of life,
Yes.
or what we want,
Yes.
or you know, or in our own feelings, or what's happened to us in the past. So then we miss maybe the relationship that we could have in front of us if we decide to slow down, put the other person first, and to, like you say, which I really like, is to actually put yourself in their shoes, but in a very practical way, to feel what they feel.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to take the time to do that, which I don't think we do very often.
No. And you see, that's why I said a while ago, church should be about relationships. The church has a mission, but it's got to be about relationships first, not actually mission first, because the mission is the explanation of what we've got in the relationships. Yeah. So if we work at relationships, people get healed. You know, I talk to a lot of people that aren't Christians, and they know I'm a Christian, and they still come for counsel and help because they know that it works in relationships. They see it working. People even come to the church who aren't Christians because they know there's something there. So it needs to be that way around. Whereas if I'm just about mission, then all we are is work colleagues, same as what you might be in any place of employment. But if we're first a family, and then a family who happens to be serving the Lord in a multitude of different ways, then that's fine. That works.
Yes. And it's so desperately needed.
Yes.
I think especially after, you know, the whole situation with COVID and coming out of it now, people are so lonely, and
yes,
the churches that I've been to do feel, you know, very disconnected from those deep relationships, and it really should be our priority.
Yes.
You know, we're created for relationship. This is what it's
absolutely.
all about.
Yep, absolutely.
So, and that's why it hurts so much, sorry, John, when relationships do break.
Yes.
That's, you know, because we're made for the healthy relationship, so we need to work towards it.
That's right. Can
Go
I
on,
just
John.
put I want to put a kind of footnote in here to try and be practical.
Yes.
So I'm thinking, I'll use one of my family members who obviously grew up within the church, within the family, loves the Lord, and then moved away, went to London, and at different points shared accommodation with other people. And I'm thinking of one young lady that she shared accommodation with, a Christian girl. And my daughter would phone me on a number of occasions, completely frustrated with this young lady, because my daughter would be kind in terms of if there was washing up to be done, she'd do it, and she'd leave the sink tidy, and yet her flatmate often didn't and was very preoccupied with herself. And what I had to say to my daughter was, you've got your standards and your values. I know you want to have a friendship with this young lady, but you can only have a friendship to the level that she allows you to. If she doesn't want to change, your relating to her can't be based on whether she wants to change or not. You have to make it work, and you accept her at the level that she's prepared to operate at. Now, obviously, there are practical things that need a challenge because there needs to be some fairness, in doing housework and all the rest of it. But that apart, because you've got those standards and values and you look for meaningful relationships, don't assume that that's what everybody else is prepared to pay the price for.
Yes.
And
it's a very important point.
I think so, because there might be all sorts of situations that we face where people just don't share that sense of journey or the importance of going to the kind of depth that we're talking about. It doesn't mean you have to walk away from those people. Just love them, relate to them at the level that they allow you to.
Accept it for what it is.
Yes, it is, and accept and love them.
Yes.
And who knows, then they may just sometime, really open up and want more. But if not, just let's walk together to the level that they allow us to.
Yes. It's a very good point, John. Thank you so much. Were there any other final thoughts or little signposts that you could offer just before we end this podcast?
Yes. A couple of things quickly. One is, and I know we've touched on this in earlier podcasts, when you're trying to get to the depth in a conversation, hear with your heart.
Yes.
And especially, again, men can be so logical. And, more than once, a lady has said, well, I tried to share what it really felt, and then my husband came back with all these logical answers, and I just ended up thinking that was me who was being silly, and I just had to get on with it. So I would say we all have to learn to hear with our hearts. That's important.
Just touching on that, then, for someone who's never even engaged with their hearts at that level, what does that feel like or look like practically to actually, hear with the heart rather than it just going straight into your head?
Yeah,
with the logic.
This is where love has to come in. So, for example, I know we keep using the husband and wife, but the principle applies for single people, within a church, within a workplace, friend to friend. So let's say a wife has consistently tried to make a simple point to her husband, and he clearly doesn't get it. Now, he will make a decision about, well, this just isn't making any sense. It seems to matter to my wife, but I can't get it. He'll have to decide to either walk away or leave her on the outside of his circle, or to be honest with his wife. So I can't get what you're saying, but I want to stick with it. Either say it again, or can you put it a different way, or is there another instance of what you're trying to describe now? What other ways do I shut you out or whatever? So that's a good example of how a relationship can become a place of healing. I mean, when I got married, I didn't have a clue that such creatures as melancholics existed.
Mm.
um, but because of my commitment for my wife and hers to me, I've got, I think, a good feel of what it feels like to be a melancholic, and that's without being one myself, obviously. But it means when a melancholic talks to me, I know exactly what they're saying and what they're feeling, because I've built that relationship with my wife and with my children that have that same temperament. In fact, I would have missed it with my children if I hadn't built the relationship with my wife.
Wow.
So as part of my journey with the Lord and my discipleship of Jesus, I have an obligation to love, which is to get in touch with what the one I love is trying to say. And if you then extend that across the church, you can see that should and could be a very powerful thing.
I love it. That's a beautiful way to close it. Just that sentence, I think,
Yes.
get in touch with what the one I love is trying to say.
Yes.
That's really lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you, John.
You're very
Did you have
welcome.
another thought on your mind? Did I cut
Well,
in too
no,
quickly?
you're okay. There's one final thing,
Oh, yes,
and
please.
that is that we all have to submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's Ephesians. You've got that little section that's introduced, and then Paul goes into husbands, love your wives, and so on and so forth, and children and parents, and there's a whole host of relationships. But it's prefaced with submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So we can be safe together. We can be safe in a family and safe in God's family if the ultimate point of reference is Jesus himself. So in practice, it might mean a wife or even a child or a parent is trying to say something. Let's stick with the wife. Wife says something to her husband. He doesn't like it. You get a very human reaction, which is quite understandable, especially if he's got self-worth issues. He'll be defensive and all the rest. But if she knows that he loves the Lord more than anything and anyone else, she knows he'll come back because of his walk with the Lord. So it might be 10 minutes later and say, come on, we need to sit down and talk. It might be after he's been for a nice long walk and then come in and say, and come in with a different and an open attitude. Let Jesus be head of our families, of our church family, of our lives. And so it's not about control. It's not about authoritarianism. It's about love as we submit to Jesus, the one who loves us.
Thank you, John.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
That was a great episode with John Sparks about relationship conflict. Just to let you know, if you are listening to this podcast, you can also watch this podcast over on YouTube. If you search Grow Your Dreams, you will find me over there. I'll be uploading every Thursday a new podcast. So come and enjoy it there. Also, give us a like, give us a subscribe, drop a comment, whatever button you can press to show your support. Please do go ahead and do that. You can also check me out on Instagram at Grow Your Dreams Podcast. And if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, wherever you're listening to this, please do go ahead and leave a review and drop some comments. You can also send me a message at Grow Your Dreams Podcast to let me know what you thought about this episode, as well as share it with your loved ones, because everybody has got relationship conflicts and everybody needs to learn to understand each other. So share. Sharing is caring. Be blessed, guys. Till next Thursday. Bye.